everybody. Welcome to Psychedelics today. It's David Drapkin here, having a conversation with Melanie Pincus and Manesh Girn. And you're in two beautiful places in the world. I'm in New Jersey as usual. So, yeah, just tell us where you're at. Manesh, where are you, mate?
Yeah, right now I'm over in Mexico in a small beach town called Mazunte in Oaxaca. And so it's this very small, what I would call a hippie beach town. It's only, the population here is around 1,000 people, mostly foreigners. And so, yeah, been out living as a digital nomad since January.
Lovely. So you've had a good winter. Is it even winter there? Or is it kind of, I guess it's probably just north of the equator, is it?
Yeah, it's been perpetual sunshine. It's, here it's 30 degrees, like that's Celsius, I don't know, Fahrenheit, by 80s Fahrenheit and sunny every single day since I got here. So not to make people too jealous who are not in a place like this.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful, interesting. And yeah, Melanie, whereabouts are you?
I'm in southern Brazil, so the state where Florianopolis is, but inland. And I'm headed to Florianopolis in a few days, and I'll be there by the coast for another month. And it is wrapping up summertime here, so it is also very nice weather.
Yeah. So your brains are having a lovely bit of time over there, and your bodies and your souls as well. And I hope we get to talk about, obviously, the brain, but yeah, body and soul as well, how that comes into it. Before we dive in, talking about psychedelic neuroscience, I'd love to just get to know you a wee bit more. So Manesh, you've been on the show a lot, so folks know you already. And Melanie, I think this is your first time, yeah?
Correct.
Awesome. Amazing. And you're one of our teachers in our Vital program, so it's, as are you, Manesh, so it's great having you, Melanie. But yeah, Manesh, just tell folks a wee bit about yourself. How did you come into the world of psychedelic neuroscience?
Yeah, so I've had an interest in psychedelics for quite a while, and my interest in psychedelics initially came in my late teens through interest in meditation and Eastern spirituality and these kinds of things, and the reading I had been doing, and I discovered Stan Grof, I think when I was 17, 18, something like this, and was really fascinated by what he was describing and the different types of experiences people can go under psychedelics. And it really went against what I was told and what I learned in school, with quote unquote drug education, before kind of really just, making it seem like you'll go crazy if you take LSD. It's a hard drug. It's dangerous. Same with mushrooms. But then having my eyes opened, and then not going to pretend it's not the case. After some personal experiences, I was very fascinated in how our experience of the world can be so radically altered. And it made me want to know more about how our experience is constructed at the level of the brain and the mind, and what kind of mediates how we perceive ourselves and relate to ourselves and the world. And so this threw me into an interest in philosophy and psychology, and then that led me to neuroscience. And I was lucky enough to meet the right people and the right mentors and get into the right research labs. And so then now I'm just finishing up my PhD in neuroscience, going to graduate in June here, hopefully. I will graduate in June. That's the plan. And so my PhD work has been on the default mode network, doing fMRI research on brain imaging research on that network, which we can talk about more later. Talk about a lot in the course. And also on psychedelics, because I was lucky enough to build a collaboration with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who has been the lead brain imaging person in psychedelics the past decade. Lucky enough to make a collaboration with him back in 2018-ish, and we've had a great, friendship collaboration since then. And in August, I'll be moving to San Francisco to work with him as a postdoc, doing more psychedelic neuroscience research. So that's kind of my trajectory in a nutshell.
Beautiful. Yeah, lots of questions and meaning making that it started with there. Awesome. And how far have you got in that journey of finding answers to those questions and the meaning making?
Right. I've only learned there's more and more questions. The answer to my questions is more questions.
But yeah, congrats on almost getting to your PhD. We can't wait to be at your graduation ceremony, and it's richly deserved. And Melanie, you're a PhD who's ready. So yeah, tell us a wee bit about your kind of generation of Genesis story and how you found psychedelic neuroscience in your life.
Sure. I never know how far back to go, but I'll start with my PhD, where I studied at Emory University, and I was focusing on the legacy of early life stress and trauma on the developing brain and how it places individuals at risk for developing mood disorders, uh, starting at the pubertal transition and into adulthood. And I started my PhD in 2011, and that is when a lot of psychedelic research was starting to come out and showing really an incredible efficacy for these mood disorders that are difficult to treat. There hasn't been major progress on conventional pharmacotherapies in a long time. So I was seeing that research and getting interested in psychedelic action on the brain and what it was doing to really help move the needle for these hard to treat mood disorders. So from a professional angle, I was really interested in psychedelics. And then I also consider myself a seeker. I've so much curiosity about consciousness and life and everything. And so hearing people's trip reports, reading an anthology of tripping reports, I just found myself incredibly curious about the psychedelic experience. So after my time in academia, I had a sabbatical and went down to Peru and sat with ayahuasca in a retreat. I also had a tobacco dieta and then sat with San Pedro for a couple of ceremonies. So I kind of did like speed dating with different psychedelics down there. And then having my own experiences like really leveled up my curiosity and interest in psychedelics, how they're having the therapeutic action they're having, how they create such wildly different experiences, even from journey to journey for a single person. And also, one of the burning questions that started to come up for me was, why is entering a mystical state so easeful for some people and so much more difficult for others? So, all of these questions were arising for me. And so that directed me on this path professionally to get involved in the psychedelic space. So I sought out opportunities and served as chief scientific officer for two different psychedelic startups, designing research programs for them. And then meanwhile, I also have an artistic side. So I started consulting some artists who wanted to create experiences of transcendence through their art installations. And that was really nurturing my creative side. So in the last 6 months or so, I've been pivoting in that direction and actually scaling to a more meta place where I'm currently working on researching and designing transformative experiences. And so the focus initially is going to be on art installations and how to create these direct experiences of transcendence, awe, group flow, individual flow, these kinds of states. And then eventually get into designing and delivering workshops and retreats that can also create access points to these different states.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to hear more about that. One quick question. Are you talking to some extent about like sacred architecture, or is it more installations that one looks at?
Sure, both actually. And as a starting point, I can share an experience I had at Burning Man this past year. I stumbled upon this kinetic art sculpture that was like a metal cylinder with cutouts, cutout shapes, and then there was light coming from the inside of the cylinder, and you could spin the whole thing. And as you did, it created this strobe effect. And as I was watching it, I felt myself being drawn into this state of like non-duality and ego dissolution, and fear would come up for me. And then I would step back from it and let the cylinder slow down again and then respin it. And so I was like able to sort of titrate this experience of going into and out of this non-dual state. And somebody came up to me and told me that this piece was based on the Dream Machine created by Brian Geisen in the 60s and 70s, which they had like a miniature version of it that they put on a turntable. And they realized that when the turntable was set to like 78 rotations per minute, it would elicit a state of ego dissolution in people who were watching it in the room. So there are ways that we can use visual stimuli, auditory stimuli to bring you into states that are similar to transcendent states that are induced by psychedelics.
Amazing. Thanks for adding that, Melanie. Yeah, I didn't know about that. And, I'd love to just jump in about the brain and its relationship to us as beings. Do you feel like, to what extent are you two kind of hardcore neuroscientists, whatever that means? And are you able to integrate senses of, wonder and awe and spirituality and kind of, that non-duality that transcends the brain and consciousness itself, kind of being a non-brain reality?
Right. I could tackle that question first. I think,
Yeah, please.
well, I think for me, I mean, I can't speak for Melanie, but I think, well, what I think is like based on how we've just described ourselves, we're not typical neuroscientists in the usual sense of it. We're kind of both seekers, exploring different states and experiences and pushing the grain of what we know. And I think we have a greater degree of openness and kind of openness to what we don't know. And at least for myself, like less certainty on, like philosophical certainty, you could say, about the brain's place in everything and the nature of consciousness and all this kind of stuff. Like for me, I think there are certain questions we can't possibly know. Like what is we can't possibly know conceptually, at least in terms of what is the nature of consciousness, how does it relate to the brain? We just know it seems to co-occur with it, and the mind co-occurs with brain activity. But there's a lot we don't know, and I think there's a tendency sometimes to extrapolate from kind of empirical findings, scientific findings, to philosophical assumptions about the nature of things. And so, like for me, it's like there are a lot of things we don't know, and on those things, I'm very open to it going either way. And I like to have this kind of skepticism and openness, even to the scientific materialist paradigm of modern science. And I like to historicize the fact. The state of neuroscience and our knowledge, like we're just another point in history. We don't have complete knowledge about how things are in any scientific, in any discipline, right? Like we're just at a particular point in our evolution of knowledge and understanding. And we often, as does probably every historical epoch, assume that we have it all figured out and what we're seeing is correct in some way. And so I like to have a radical openness and explore different things experientially, and open to reading far out things and contemplating ideas and not being dismissive. Whether it's about consciousness beyond the brain, or the nature of DMT experiences and elves and all these kinds of things, or spirits and ayahuasca, of the plants of the ayahuasca itself. I skew towards being agnostic but open on a lot of these questions, and not certain on either side. And so in that way, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a hardcore neuroscientist, because a hardcore neuroscientist would say everything's in the brain. If you believe in stuff beyond the brain, you're just the term that Terence McKenna used once was epistemically naive.
I love that.
Yeah, right. It's such a great term. In that, like, you're not rigorous in your thinking, and you're not rigorous in what you determine to be knowledge. That would be the perspective for those people, and they would distrust people who are too radically open about the nature of the brain and consciousness. That would be a hardcore neuroscientist that I would describe, and I can list off names, but I'm not going to, of people who are like that, who are well known.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll stop there. I'll let Melanie answer.
That was great. Thanks, man.
Yeah, that was a really thorough and good answer. Yeah, I would not describe myself as a hardcore materialist. I feel like I take a both and approach, which has been one of my favorite expressions lately for lots of different things. But yeah, so I for sure think there's a really important place for the biological basis of the mind. And then there's also a part of me that feels like a lot of skepticism that explains the entire equation. And I'm really open to phenomena that might be beyond the brain, and that perhaps consciousness is truly more of a field phenomenon, and we're able to tune into that field with our biological apparatus. So yeah, I feel like my mind got opened up to a less materialist view through my own psychedelic experiences.
Awesome. I'm so wanting to go on a tangent, but I'm going to try hard not to yet, because we've got loads to talk about. And yes, we are going to talk about the course that you have both created and built and filmed and are going to teach live as well. So I want to tell people about it, and then we'll just dive in. So Melanie and Manesh have designed a course, and they're partnering with us here, called Psychedelic Neuroscience Demystified: How Psychedelics Alter Consciousness and Produce Therapeutic Effects. Starts May 17th, and it's going to run for 8 weeks, so once a week, and there's 10 hours of materials that they've pre-recorded that you get to watch, as well as do that live work of 12 hours of live FaceTime, kind of Zoom time. And if you apply before April 12th, then you can get $100 off. So that's the course. There is the promo spiel done. So first question is, why did you want to do this course? So who is this for, and what are they going to get from it? Tell us all about it.
Sure, I'll jump in. So this course was definitely designed with clinicians and therapists in mind, or anyone who's a practitioner in the psychedelic space, but we also very deliberately made the information as accessible to the lay person as possible. So it's really for anyone with an interest in psychedelic neuroscientists. So students, anyone really who is curious about this field. And we really wanted to provide a holistic and comprehensive understanding of psychedelics and how they're acting therapeutically. And so it's pretty challenging to explain how they act in a very succinct way, and that will leave somebody with a true understanding without having background on the brain and how it works and how it functions, how it's organized, and what goes awry in mood disorders and stress-related disorders. That really helps somebody develop a true understanding of the tremendous healing potential of these substances. And then the other facet I wanted to touch on too is that we really feel like the information in this course, we designed it so that it has true relevance for application in the clinical realm. So we feel like there's so much good science now and good neuroscience that can inform how people work with their clients in terms of like helping them set up for and make sense of their psychedelic experience, and ways to optimize the preparation before going into a psychedelic journey, the actual psychedelic journey in terms of thinking about dosing and type of substance to work with, and then also in the integration period where there's this heightened window of neuroplasticity and how one could really work with a client to best take advantage of that window of opportunity to lead to lasting change.
Sounds awesome. Sign me up. Yeah, really cool. Manesh, anything you want to add, particularly about why you and Melanie felt so drawn to work together on this one?
Right. Well, Melanie and I were initially introduced through Kyle at Psychedelics Today, and we've become really good friends and share a lot of interests in all of this. And on my end, I had an interest. Well, actually, no, both of us have had a large interest in education for a long time. Like Melanie has taught courses on play and neuroscience at Columbia, and like done lots of cool stuff. And then me, I have my YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, where I really try to explain the scientific research around psychedelics in an accessible way. And that was something that emerged for me during the pandemic, back when I started having more free time. And it's like, how am I going to prevent myself from going crazy? And how can I use my time effectively? And also noticing the nature of the media landscape around psychedelics, right? These things, especially, back in 2019, they're just starting to emerge into the mainstream media. You're seeing articles in outlets and more coverage. And me as a scientist, knowing the research literature, knowing what this stuff actually kind of says, would cringe a lot on how things are being talked about in the media. It's either sensationalistic or like just downright wrong, or just simplistic to a kind of a large degree, and people are propagating narratives which don't really fully align with what the research actually tells us. And then so I was like, how can I use my knowledge and my connections and my understanding, and then convey that to the world to a greater degree to help improve the landscape and provide reliable knowledge that's also accessible for the layperson. And so this was a big interest of mine. And I had been thinking also, how can I make videos on Instagram and make YouTube videos, but kind of like, how can I offer something more comprehensive? And then in chats with Melanie, we floated the idea of doing this. I don't remember exactly how it came up, but it came idea. It's a comprehensive neuroscience course would be great. I don't really have the time to do it myself. She didn't really have the time to do it herself. Let's do it together. And so basically that's what we've done, and we've been working on it quite a while. And so we're really, really excited for it to be released. Basically, it's our combined minds coming together. It's like, how can we best convey psychedelic neuroscience to this audience, and how can we best choose the topics and the structuring that, facilitates understanding, is relevant for people in a practical sense as well as theoretical, and is just interesting and fun at the same time, because this is a fascinating area that a lot of people are interested in, but also can be intimidating. And so we're trying to, provide access in a way that's not too intimidating, I'd hope, and accessible. And we're going to, hand walk you through psychedelic neuroscience to help people be participants in the ongoing discussions, and to be able to understand research, and also be able to get a sense like, this is a shitty article. This article is not good. Like, we want to equip you with the ability to say that about something, because you have the background knowledge.
Awesome. Oh, I love it. It sounds really cool. I love, we're saying this is important stuff to know about if we're working in the field of psychedelics in whatever role we have. And it's quite difficult to make sense of it for lay people in particular, and to know how to use it practically. Like, what do I do with this? I think the practical piece is really important. Like, not many people have bridged that. I think, how do we use this research and this knowledge to help people more, to have, improved efficacy, to develop new kind of, treatment protocols, or particularly with microdosing. I'm really interested in how that can be used more moving forwards. And I love hearing about, Carl, matchmaking there and bringing you two together on a professional sense. Good on you, Carl. All right, so I'm going to be a bit quirky now. Ask 7 questions. Manesh, you go first with your answer then, Melanie. Quick fire answers. It's definitely more of a right brain you need to engage here. Okay. Deep breath. First question. They're all about the brain. Let's see how much you know. First question. Have you ever watched the scene in Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom when they eat monkey brains?
I don't think I have. I remember him pulling out the guy's heart, but I don't remember the monkey brain scene.
So you've repressed that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Melanie, how about you, mate?
Yeah, so you definitely have seen it. You just don't remember it.
Yeah.
Same here. I watched it as a child, and I remember the heart being pulled out scene, but not the monkey brain
Wow,
scene.
That's fascinating, because I just watched it about a month ago in England with my mum and dad and my 2 kids, and they were like, we had to pause it and say what was going on. It was like, they aren't real monkey brains and eyeball soup, and that's not really his heart being pulled out. But yeah, interesting scenes there. Question 2, have either of you ever eaten brains? Manesh.
Have I eaten brains? No. It might be concerning that I had to think about that, but don't believe not knowingly.
Okay, man. Melanie.
There's that funky name for brains.
Like edible brains?
There's a dish I think called sweetbread. Is that it?
Yes, that's it, or something like that.
You had some sweetbread.
I feel like I did sample that at one point in time, but have a foggy memory of it, so I can't report on what it tasted like.
Because in some cultures, brains are eaten. I remember being on school in a French supermarket on a trip, and they were selling horse brains there. And I once ate sheep's brains just to try it, and it wasn't very nice. Question.
Actually, I'm also realizing I've eaten whole ground crickets, so that would include their brains.
Interesting. So crickets have brains. Interesting. All right, question 3. Have either of you dissected brains? I'm assuming you have. What was it like? What did you find? What was the experience like, kind of exploring and digging into the brain?
Yeah, I have. I did it. I had a functional neuroanatomy course at McGill University, and we had real brains that were donated. And it was fascinating. I mean, it's just this squishy blob of matter. And you think, like, for that person, their entire life, experiences, memories, hopes were all happening in this little blob that's in my hand. And just seeing all the layers of blood vessels and how everything's connected to each other. It's just fascinating, and it's downright bizarre that somehow this thing can give rise to experience and consciousness. It's like, how the hell is that even possible? And it's much more like the mystery and wonder of that is much more clear when you're looking at this physical thing in front of you, which is this wet blob.
Wow.
A similar experience my first year of my PhD program. We did a brain dissection, and yeah, it was a really humbling experience. And I weirdly remember feeling gratitude to the human who had dedicated their body to science in this way. And I'd almost describe it as like, déjà vu. It's like the opposite of deja vu, where you see a word that you're really familiar with and then it just seems foreign all of a sudden. It was like almost like that, where I'm like, there's this weird feeling of disconnect where it's like, how can so much consciousness and lived experience like be contained in this brain? So it was a really interesting and strange experience at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Next question. Going a little bit deeper. Have either of you ever compared or thought of similarities between the brain and the universe? If so, how are they comparable?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there are images that, show a bunch of neurons connected to each other in the brain and relating that to, I guess, nebula and universes and this kind of stuff. And there's a visual similarity. And I think here's one way that they're similar, is that they're both composed of a whole variety of parts which interact with each other to some degree. And so they're both these massive complex systems. Whereas in the universe, there's, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of stars, and then many, many planets around each star and so on. There's different levels of organization. You can look at it. You could look at the level of stars, clusters of planets, and so on. But then at the whole level, there's the whole universe of all these different elements, which are kind of together in some way. They're all as part of this whole. And then if you go to the brain, you can look at individual neurons. You can look at groups of clusters of neurons. You can look at clusters of clusters, which form regions, clusters of regions, which form networks, but they're all a part of the brain as a whole. So they're both, just like the universe and the brain and the universe are both similar in that they're these complex systems at multiple scales with different clusters of interconnected elements that interact and are related to each other.
You really went there. Beautiful. That was great. On the spot, Manesh. Awesome.
Yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah, how about you,
He's
Melanie?
a really good ripper. Okay, so when I was in grad school, I was saying that I studied the legacy of early life stress and trauma. And I was thinking about how it's kind of wild that the earliest experiences you have in life, you don't have much memory of. It's from the pre-verbal time of your life. And yet it has actually an outsized influence on the way your psyche and psychology develops. And so I started thinking about it in this way, that it's almost like the psyche's black hole, because at the center of all of the bigger galaxies is a supermassive black hole, and there are such powerful gravitational forces that they direct the motion of a lot of celestial bodies around them. And then I ended up seeing a episode of Through the Wormhole about Janna Levin's work. And she's an astrophysicist who studies lots of really cool phenomena. But she, in particular, one of the things she studies is the way that when two galaxies collide that have massive black holes at their center, those black holes start attracting each other and repelling each other in this really beautiful dance around one another until they finally collide. And I was so moved by that as this really beautiful parallel to us, where we attract different people into our lives and move away from different people into our lives. And a lot of that is being driven by our earliest life experiences and the way we created attachments to our parents or had impaired attachments. And I was so inspired that I actually got a tattoo on my back of one of her data representations of the collision course of two black holes.
Wow. That's so cool. Oh my God, thank you for being so cool, you two. This is great, far out. And yeah, just thinking about black holes and how that applies to the brain. And I'm also thinking about the Big Bang, and consciousness. Consciousness, I think, existed before the brain, and maybe when there was a Big Bang analogy, that's when it popped into the brain. But we can riff off that another time. Next question is, what percentage of our brains do we typically use in the average day? And is it true or a myth that women use more percentage of their brains than men?
I mean, yeah, I feel like this is kind of the answer is the brain, why would we want to use our entire brain at the same time? Because our brain has different regions that do different things. So it really wouldn't make sense for us to use our entire brain at the whole time. Do we want to be swimming, writing, and thinking, and gardening at the same time? And it wouldn't make sense. So I think we need to understand that the brain is not one, is not some uniform thing where it's all the same and you can use some percentage of it. It's like different combinations of different regions and networks are involved at any given time. And the brain needs to be selective in what it's using in order to be focused on a particular thing that it's doing. If you want to be, writing a paper, you don't want to be using the whole brain. You want to be using the specific regions that are useful for writing that paper, right? And so I think it's really context specific what parts of the brain are needed. And to say we don't use our entire brain doesn't really make any sense. That's why at the initial stages, I wanted to say this question doesn't make sense, because doesn't make sense to answer that question. And then, yeah, in terms of whether women use more of their brain, I've never heard that before. And I wonder where that came from, because it sounds like nonsense to me, to be honest.
Yeah, I feel like what I have heard, which is a misconception, is that we only use 10% of our brains, and that's not true. I concur with what Manesh said in the sense that the brain is in constant dynamic flux in terms of which regions and networks are currently being utilized in processing different things, different signals and information coming in. But in general, yeah, we are using all of our brain throughout our lifetime, but it just, in any given snapshot of a moment, we might have some regions and networks being more active and others quieter. The claim about women, I'm wondering if maybe the origin of that is the psychology research around women being better at multitasking and having more distributed attention, whereas men excel more at focalized attention in certain tasks that they've looked at. So I don't know the neuroscience behind that, but it perhaps is the case that women have more distributed connectivity to support that multitasking ability, but I'm not certain about it.
Appreciate both of your answers. Yeah, I sit corrected. Thank you for that one. Two more quirky questions. One is, I asked you this question on our webinar the other day. What percentage, I like percentages, how much do we currently know about the brain? And you don't have to do a percentage, you kind of batted that away in a cricket term, but how do you think we're in a golden age of understanding the brain right now, or is it just another kind of stage in the evolution of our understanding of consciousness of the brain itself?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I think we could argue for golden age for the last, let's say, since the 90s, because we're actually able to image a living awake brain, and that's been a major development. And since the emergence of different, I'm not going into the details, different ways of imaging the awake brain, we will just say that, which have just emerged since the late 80s, more or less, and with fMRI in the 90s and really coming to fruition in the late 90s and 2000s, early 2000s. It's like we've had more technological developments which have allowed us to study the brain in awake humans to a greater degree. And this has opened the door to more understanding of how the brain functions, but also a whole variety of problems around interpreting, making sense of, analyzing this data. And so the certainty of a lot of our conclusions is often thrown into question a little bit too. And it's hard to say where we are, because a new technology can be introduced in the next decade, and that can overturn and replace all the frameworks we have based on previous technologies. No clue what that would look like and how and to what extent that'll happen. And an analogy, well, it's basically the concept of paradigms, right? And so an analogy or a similar situation is going from Newtonian physics to Einstein's general relativity. They both describe motions of planets and gravity, but in very different terms. But they're describing the same phenomena, and both, you can't say one is right and one is wrong. They just describe a greater variety of phenomena with greater ease, or are able to fit in more anomalies, and kind of quirks of the theories. And so there are different frameworks of thinking which can explain the same phenomena in, as you could say, varying levels of nuance or kind of smoothness. But then to say that one is we're reaching a higher percentage of understanding, that gets really messy. And especially we have no idea if we're just operating in this kind of small area where we think we have understanding, but then there's so many other ways of viewing it and fitting all the pieces together that we just have no idea about. They're unknown unknowns. And so I think in neuroscience, we've seemed to have progressed in that we've accumulated a lot of knowledge and information. But the value of that knowledge and tying it into theoretical frameworks, which actually tell us we can actually understand it, that is very unclear and messy. So yeah, that was a very abstract answer, but I hope,
Thanks, man.
It was understandable.
Yeah, I concur with Manesh that it's super hard to really draw the line of how much progress we've made and how much more progress we have left to go. And there are so many unknown unknowns. I feel like there are some things we've really mapped out well in neuroscience. Like we have a really clear and solid understanding, for example, of the different sensory circuits. So incoming auditory information, how that's processed, incoming visual information. So the motor cortex and outgoing motor actions. So those areas have been pretty well characterized. I feel like where there's still a lot of open questions and a lot more to map out is a lot of the higher level cognitive processes like creativity, decision-making, imagination, even how rewarding different stimuli are and how we're responding to our lives in hedonic pleasure, eudaimonic pleasure, like all these kinds of like higher level meaning making, like all of those sorts of phenomenon are much harder to map out and characterize. So I feel like we're still in the early days of understanding these much more complex phenomenon. And yeah, just as like an example too of thinking about the amygdala, it has this reputation for being the fear center of the brain, and it does have direct connections with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress axis and can turn it on. But it's really overly simplistic to say that it's just responding to signaling of threat in the environment, because it also seems to really respond to what's salient and important. And sometimes it doesn't matter whether it's a threat signal, it's just whether it's a important and salient signal. So there's all these nuances for even a region that we think we've characterized really well. It's actually, the story is a lot more complex.
Yeah. And it's interesting just thinking about the comparison we did to the universe and how much we know of the universe and how far our space telescopes can go. And, that new technology enables us to go further, but we don't know much about the universe really. And I think, the brain is such an amazing organ. It's chemical, it's biological, it's electrical. I also want to talk about kind of hormones and neurotransmitters, just as the final quirky-ish question. There's a term I came across called happy hormones: dopamine, serotonin, endorphin, and oxytocin. So to what extent is that a good term to use, happy hormones? And also to what extent are those 4 hormones, neurotransmitters, like a key part of where wellness comes and healing comes and kind of creativity and peace of mind come from, and why or why not?
Hmm. I mean, the short answer is it's much more complex than that, and it's not really all those neurotransmitters do a whole variety of things. Like serotonin regulates, development of your brain, your mood, but also things like digestion, and a whole variety of physiological processes. And to say like higher serotonin is higher happiness is quite like pure nonsense is what I want to say. I was trying to say it in a lighter way, but it's really much more than that. And um, but I mean, like, let's walk through them maybe. Like serotonin, one of the ways we talk about it in the course, and which is a major function of it in terms of psychological function, as a stress response system. It helps you cope and deal with stress in your life. And it initiates responses and changes in your brain and behavior, which allow you to cope with stress or to kind of deal with it in more active ways. And so serotonin it goes up high when you're very stressed out and is a stress modulator. And I think the link to happiness came because SSRIs or antidepressant drugs increase serotonin. And the thought is like, oh, if they increase it, that means serotonin means happiness. But that's not something you could say. And in fact, the thing with SSRIs, for example, is that they increase serotonin right away, but it takes weeks for people to feel better. And it's actually the brain's changes in response to serotonin. It's compensation and like kind of downstream later changes. Those are what improve mood, not increases in serotonin itself. And for dopamine is primarily a motivation compound transmitter. It tells you this is good. You should do this more. You should engage actions to get this goal or get this reward more often. And there's been studies suggesting that if you block dopamine, you still get pleasure. You just lose your wanting of something. And so it's not, pleasure doesn't equal dopamine either. And in fact, endorphins, which you also listed, are more so related to feelings of pleasure. And even eating really good chocolate, it's endorphins that mediate that pleasure more or less, not dopamine. Dopamine is going to tell you to get that more, but endorphins are going to be more of the pleasure. And oxytocin is involved in a whole variety of things too, but social bonding, pair bonding, empathy. And so those neurotransmitters you listed, they could all, in some sense, relate to positive mood states, but it's much more complex. And what they're actually doing to contribute to that is very nuanced and complex, and they all play very different roles too.
Beautiful. Yeah, and that explanation you gave, Manesh, just helps move away from this idea that you just take a pill and you feel happy. Like, oh yeah, here's a serotonin pill, or do this and you get more oxytocin. It's, it might have that downstream effect, but it's not necessarily just you take a pill and you get better. Like, there's also behavioral change and kind of lifestyle change and social aspects as well. That I think we could bring into the conversation. Any thoughts for you, Melanie, around this subject?
I feel like Manesh's answer was so good and so thorough that I'm just going to add two little addendums, which for dopamine, it is really complex and plays an important role in motivation. And to that point, it is released when there's an acute stressor and also in response to pain. And it's been theorized that in those conditions or contexts, it's really providing motivation to the individual to respond effectively and cope with the immediate stressor presenting a threat to the organism. So I wanted to add that in. And then with oxytocin, right? Yeah, the picture is so complicated because we tend to think of it as this bonding love hormone, and it certainly plays that role. And also there's been research showing that it can enhance feelings of connection and love towards people of the in-group, but it can also increase feelings of animosity towards members of an out-group. So it's not so simple that we can just say, oh, it just plays this one role of social bonding. There's so much more context that needs to be included in the picture.
That's bloody great. Thanks, Melanie. It makes me think about psychedelics not necessarily making everyone happy or hippies or peace-loving people. You know, if someone goes in with quite strong narcissistic traits, they are quite likely to leave with those. And I've met a few folks who I couldn't believe it. It's like, oh my God, and you've done how many ayahuasca ceremonies and you would still believe this about, you know, people? And oh my gosh. So it's interesting, isn't it? It makes me want to just open up about integration. So thanks for those 7 quirky questions. Let's just open the floor up now between the three of us. Can we talk about integration, and particularly from what we know about the brain, how can we use that to help folks integrating from psychedelic experiences? What can help them, in a sense, make sense of what's going on, or to kind of really lock in that neuroplasticity or kind of that change in their lifestyle and habits and much more? So yeah, just how do we translate that into integration?
Melanie, do you want to take that first, or I have no problem doing it?
You kick it off.
Okay, yeah. I think, well, for me, a core part of integration is using the opportunity that psychedelics gave you, both in terms of the psychological insights and perspectives you might have gotten, but also the boost in neuroplasticity. And the research is mostly done in rodents, and there's not that much in humans, and we go into this in detail in the course. But the research suggests that around about 4 to 6 hours after ingesting, let's say, psilocybin or ayahuasca, until about 72 hours is the maximum neuroplasticity window that you're getting. And so during that period, you, and this is speculative, of course, but likely have an increasing ability to create new habits and encode the insights you got in your experience in a more of a lasting way. Because again, just having a boost in neuroplasticity doesn't mean that those are going to change into connections that are conducive to well-being and health and are going to last. They can be very transient. And so I think the kind of way in which you concretize your insights into actions that you repeat and are consistent with is so important in using that neuroplasticity to create connections that are conducive to the health or growth that you want to move into. And in all this, one thing else I want to say is, like, as we've been discussing, is context matters. When you come out of it, is your social context conducive to the changes you have? Do you feel well supported? Is your physical environment good? Is the context you're creating in your body good with your diet? And there's so many different factors which intertwine with the effects that psychedelics have on our brain and body, which are very important for sustaining and keeping those changes going and keeping it in a good direction. So there are a variety of factors which intersect with neuroplasticity and the brain changes and psychological changes induced by psychedelics.
Cool. I can add to that a few thoughts. Sorry, I just knocked my table. One thought is for people who are interested in stacking modalities. There's other modalities that are really potent at promoting neuroplasticity. So if you want to synergize with the window of plasticity during the integration period, you could for sure partake in regular exercise, because that's one of the most well-known plasticity promoters. And then also, I'm a huge fan of play, and that's also been shown to robustly promote neuroplasticity. And in particular, the type of play that is really good at promoting neuroplasticity is play where you have to switch perspectives and take different perspectives. And that would also be really conducive to synergizing with the psychedelic experiences where you're having a new meta perspective on your own life and considering different vantage points, including other people's vantage points. So it could be really incredible to continue to work with that by doing types of play in the integration period that also facilitate that kind of perspective shifting, role taking types of changes. And the other thought I had too was around emotion regulation. So we do see lasting changes in regions of the brain that are really important for emotion regulation, including the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, and the ways these circuits are connected. And so I also feel like the integration period would be a really wise time to partake in activities where you're really strengthening emotion regulation. So there's so many empirically based practices that strengthen emotion regulation, including meditation, journaling, expressive writing, those kinds of things. So that would be another way to really take advantage of that opportunity.
Those things are brilliant, Melanie. Is anyone doing that kind of research, looking into to what extent those have impacts on outcomes?
In combination with psychedelics?
Yeah, as an integration practice.
I feel like the integration period of time has gotten very little attention. There's some research starting to come out now about the integration period, but it's like all the low-hanging fruit. So yeah, I don't think we've really done a lot yet to look at these sorts of questions in the integration period. Manesh, what do you think?
Yeah, I also agree. I mean, integration is so understudied, and we really don't know how different practices in the integration period change outcomes. Like, we just can't say anything definitive there. I do think as we move forward, the more and more either companies or institutions are going to be looking at that. But I do think combining these kinds of techniques are essential. There is one study actually that came to mind with ketamine, because ketamine is often seen as something you just take it and you leave. In the typical way it's given in a lot of clinics in the States, for example, is as a standalone pharmacological treatment, and not one that's given in a psychedelic psychotherapy container with the prep and integration. And there's one study that combined this particular, I think it was a CBT based or schema therapy based paradigm around sense of self or beliefs about oneself or something like this, and it enhanced outcomes and made them stronger and longer, from what I remember. And so that this just there suggests that probably the potent neuroplasticity boost induced by ketamine synergized with this intervention to make it more powerful in creating lasting change. And I think that's really the case with all the psychedelics too. And I think there's extreme potential in the combination, like the targeted combination of psychedelics with particular other techniques, interventions, practices. So I think there's a lot of synergies to be had there.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that there's some evidence that neuroplasticity increases the way that people respond to neurorehabilitation if they have had stroke or things like this. So the plasticity afforded by the psychedelics could also be really well paired with these rehabilitation techniques in the integration period.
Awesome. I wanted to come back to something you said, Melanie, about play, and particularly play where you're changing perspective. And I'm thinking from a therapeutic discipline, the popularity of internal family systems, or even kind of more Gestalt work as well, and even ceremonial work where you're kind of changing your perspective or becoming a slightly altered being or seeing reality in a different way. That is a different kind of play and changing of perspective, and that definitely can bring healing, because therapeutically we often just need to get out of our ruminating, quite restricted sense of self, and play and express, and art and dance and nature help to reinforce that as an integration, just to expand and transcend our normal sense of self.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like what's really powerful about play is that it's this experience of safety to try new alternative ways of being and considering things. And so it does allow you to have a more flexible brain state and explore new perspectives and ways of approaching things that you otherwise wouldn't have considered. And the other thing I wanted to just throw into the mix too is I do feel like for people who have had an experience of early life trauma, I do think that there's a tendency to sort of skip the high period of play, which is like 4 to 5 years old, is when people are partaking in a lot of imaginative play. And so if you've skipped that period, I do think there is something really healing about returning to childhood in a sense and giving yourself permission to re-experience that state that you skipped over in your early life.
Yeah, so, as a therapist, I've worked with people and had my own personal experiences where using psychedelics during the medicine session as well as integration afterwards, it's kind of doing some of that inner child work and going back sometimes even to our birthing experience. And when we tap into that part of our life where there was trauma or where there was some stuckness, that part of us gets to be reborn or express itself or kind of release its charge and be integrated into our greater self. So awesome. I feel like trauma is actually something we should talk about. It's talked about a lot. To what extent is this something you cover in the course? How can we understand trauma and where does it live in the brain or express itself through the brain? Feel free to talk about epigenetic changes and intergenerational trauma, as well as the vagus nerve as well, and to what extent that's relevant in discussing trauma, the brain, and if that's covered in the course as well.
Sure. So we don't tackle trauma per se. We're framing it more as chronic stress. And we do talk quite a lot at the beginning of the course about how chronic stress really takes a toll on the brain at various spatial levels. So it's really disruptive to a bunch of the neurotransmitter systems, and that has profound consequences for individuals. Because of what Manesh was saying, where even something like serotonin, for example, impacts so many different things, including the way you learn. Sleep is heavily influenced by serotonin, your mood, even your body temperature is influenced by serotonin, and that's just one of the neurotransmitters. So when you're throwing out of whack these different neurotransmitter systems from chronic stress, it's going to have really profound consequences for somebody. So we talk about the neurotransmitter systems that are impacted by chronic stress, and then also scale up to understanding its impact at the level of networks and just overall global organization of how the brain becomes a lot more rigid and less flexible and gets stuck in certain states that are conducive to being overly introspective to the point of rumination. And then behaviorally, we also just talk about the evidence that chronic stress is such a profound through line across so many different disorders. So we see a really strong relationship between chronic stress, whether it happened early in life or later in life, with depression, anxiety, substance use disorder. It has a really strong relationship with that, including the likelihood of relapse, and obviously plays a huge role in post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Yeah, like the link between chronic stress and trauma, right? Because often trauma leads our nervous systems to be really sensitive and sensitized to fear, to uncertainty, and to a variety of things like that. And this makes our HPA axis, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which releases cortisol, to be hypersensitive. And so when we're in this chronically high cortisol state, that's what we call chronic stress. And as Melanie was saying, that's like it's linked to basically every mental health condition is underpinned by chronic stress or produces chronic stress. And as we discussed in the course, having high chronic stress means an upregulation of inflammatory markers, which then create brain inflammation, which can then damage neurons and lead to atrophy and reduce neuroplasticity. And this also intersects with your gut microbiome, which I talk about in one of my lectures, and how it can affect bacteria, which is anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory in your gut, and that also through the vagus nerve affects your brain and affects neurotransmitter levels. And this whole thing can also change, excuse me, your endocrine system, change your hypothalamus and its release of other hormones, and just the regulation of your body's organs and your physiology. These things are all intertwined with, stress and chronic stress and then trauma. It's all interconnected. And so the question of whether we discuss trauma or not, we're we do in all of the ways it impacts our nervous system, and how psychedelics, like serotonergic psychedelics, ketamine, MDMA, can influence the damage or the effects that it has on the brain and nervous system.
Awesome. I love that. Thanks, Manesh. And you started to talk more about gut microbiome there. And I feel like there's another piece, if we could just dive into it, around just the integrative mind-body approach that is particularly more popular and more effective within psychedelic medicine. And particularly a term in relation to trauma and chronic stress that I came across in Fellowship of the River, the book by Joe Tafur. Wonderful doctor, lovely man. He would introduce me to this term of the allostatic load, and how it's this kind of integrative mind-body trans-diagnostic or kind of trans-systemic living of stress within ourself. So anything particularly around mind-body integrative approaches, the allostatic load, how can we start to understand this throughout our different systems that we exist on?
Yeah, I could say something first. I think it's the fact that the mind and body are intimately interconnected, right? All the different systems of our body, including the brain, the immune system, the digestive system, or endocrine system, are, they're all very interconnected. And I think, even separating them into different things is just, a function of language. We're just creating concepts to parse up things which are intimately intertwined, and the boundaries between them are unclear sometimes. And we create these abstractions and words in order to talk about it. But I think sometimes we take the map for the territory. We take the words to actually indicate things that are discrete and different when they're not. And I think so everything is interconnected. Changes in your brain will then filter down, into signaling your immune system or signaling your gut, and vice versa. And that'll change your hormones. It's all very, very interconnected. And so I think it's silly to talk about one thing and say in isolation. We have to be comprehensive, especially when health is concerned. And for example, in trying to find the locus of somebody's mental health condition. Is it because you're eating processed food? Is it because when their hormonal glands is dysregulated? Is it because something psychological, something situational in their life, which is a whole other thing? Is it because they're in a chronic stress state because of maybe a gene that they have, or because of early childhood trauma or perinatal trauma around the time of birth, or they inherited some epigenetic change from their mother because she was very stressed? I mean, there's so many ways that we can look at what we would call the etiology, or like what gives rise to a particular condition. Like, we need this holistic approach. And allostatic load is kind of like, how do we respond adaptively to times of change? How do we adjust ourselves? How do we create homeostasis in a changing environment? And how do we adapt in new circumstances? And this is also a whole body, brain, nervous system, body affair as well, on how to regulate your entire organism to deal with change and to be resilient and to be adaptable. And it's not just in the brain. It's not just in the brain at all.
Thank you, man. Awesome.
I agree with everything Manesh said. And I do think taking an integrative approach in terms of beforehand preparation and in the integration period would be so incredible. And especially in terms of thinking about the gut-brain connection. I know there's a lot of evidence around prebiotics and ways you can change your diet to improve your gut health. And there's other techniques people are using, like pulse EMF applied to the gut area. I don't know the quality of the evidence, but it's becoming really popular too. So if you can provide support to your gut health, that is only going to potentially give you even greater benefits around the psychedelic work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Melanie. All right, so we're on the home front here. I want to ask you both, any things you have not yet shared that really excite you about the brain, or about psychedelic research, or about its potential to impact certain conditions, neurocognitive, neurodegenerative, mental health, addiction, trauma? What kind of things are you really excited about at the moment?
For me, one thing I'm really excited about, and this is what I'll be working with Robin Carhart Harris about at UCSF, is psychedelics seem to fundamentally be able to change how we interpret the world and how we view ourselves. And I think that underlies a lot of different disorders, all of them, in fact, because you might, even just receiving a diagnosis, people often identify with that and makes it harder for them to get over it. I am a depressed person. This is who I am. Or I am an addict, or I am somebody who suffers from OCD. That's just who I am. And often that's a major barrier to them getting better, just because their identity is entangled with it. And also a lot of our beliefs about ourselves emerge in early childhood and are just given to us without our knowledge, or we didn't choose them. We didn't choose to believe that we're not lovable, or that we're not worthy of success, or a whole variety of things we might internalize when we're young. And so I think the potential for psychedelics to target our sense of self and how we perceive and understand ourselves is a huge thing that I'm excited about and I'll be looking at.
Can't wait. Thanks, Manesh.
Cool. Thank you for this question. I really like it. So, yeah, when I was working on psychedelic research projects the last few years, it was around psilocybin. So I knew a lot less about MDMA. And in putting this course together, I did a deep dive to understand it a lot better. And I got really excited about the research with MDMA and the ways in which it interacts with memory processing, which seems to explain how people are able to willingly engage with difficult memories and content and then walk away with a different relationship to their memories. So with memory, it's really complex, but there's a reconsolidation period that happens where when a memory is reactivated, it enters this destabilized and malleable state, and it can be modified and updated before it becomes restabilized. And it seems to be the case from animal studies that MDMA is really interfering with this reconsolidation period. So when the fear memory is reactivated in rats, they gave the rats MDMA right after the fear memory was reactivated. And then a week later, they see that the rats have a much more diminished fear response to that cue. And so what they think is happening here is that when the fear memory is online with the MDMA in the system, there's such a mismatch between the traumatic memory and the unique emotional state induced by the MDMA, where you feel really soothed. And this generates this error message, and that allows the memory trace that's now in this malleable state to be updated and revised so it has less fear associated with it. And this also fits really nicely with the picture that we see from the human studies. This was done in healthy volunteers, not patients, but what they found was that people were asked to revisit their favorite and worst autobiographical memories, and the favorite memories were remembered as more emotionally intense, vivid, and more positive. And really importantly, the worst memories were rated as less negative under the influence of MDMA. And then they saw correspondingly in the neuroimaging data that a particular part of the brain, the left anterior temporal cortex, was less activated. And this area is involved in processing negative emotional memories, and it's really densely connected with the amygdala. So this is consistent with this story of how people are able to revisit negative memories, but without the heavy emotional load, and that the really soothing state of the MDMA experience allows the memory to be amended before it's reconsolidated again. So
that
I'm
was amazing.
really excited for continuing research around this question.
It's so cool. It's so cool. And in Vital, we had a workshop by Annie and Michael Mithofer, and they were able to license and show us some of the recordings of their actual sessions with patients, particularly, veterans having MDMA, and you could literally see their memories changing, like the emotions that were attached to memories of, suicides and deaths of those patients. And interesting how both of what you're saying, there's our memories, and then there's our sense of self that we construct perhaps around memory that you're both working on. So really interesting. I've got one more quick question. So, and then we can close out. So your course is pretty massive. It's 10 hours of recorded material and then 12 hours of face-to-face time. I don't know whether or not you cover canalization. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's a pretty new term, new paper that came out in the last couple of months that I haven't fully kind of understood yet or done a deep dive into. But that seems to be quite an interesting theory. And then another piece that came out was around, oh God, what was that about? It was about like a lot of what happened with the 5-HT2A receptors isn't in them themselves, it's between them, and that it's in the interactions between them and the spaces in between. So those seem to be two kind of groundbreaking theories and papers that have come out in the last couple of months. Did you manage to squeeze them into the course? And if not, tell people about it now. Like, what do you make of these two kind of new papers that have come out lately?
Can I tackle this, Melanie? So we do actually cover both these papers in our neuroplasticity section, and the canalization is this idea. It's a paper by Robin Carhart-Harris, and the idea is that really emphasizing that not all neuroplasticity is good, and that a lot of mental health conditions may occur when an initial strategy or behavior or thought pattern, which might have been helpful, like it might have been helpful to think about your problems and try to figure them out, or it might have been helpful to engage in this other behavior, but that over time, when you do it over and over again, the neuroplasticity of when you do a repetitive behavior makes it harder to escape from that and makes it your go-to strategy even when it's not appropriate. And so by canalization, it's meaning like you're creating a canal, you're creating a kind of a tunnel vision towards that particular behavior. And that, for example, you evaluating things in a useful way turned into you ruminating and incessantly worrying about it. That's one example. And it's just the paper goes into detail on different types of plasticity and ways in which it might contribute to different mental health conditions. Basically saying we need to be careful about how we're using our plasticity, and also sharing a piece on how psychedelics can help us kind of reset that. When we've canalized and kind of narrowed into one particular behavior and we're just always going to it even when it's not appropriate, psychedelics kind of expand that canal a bit and give us more behavioral flexibility, in behavior to explore different ways of responding to that same situation. And then that can create plasticity, which then can help us get out of that and canalize maybe into something else that's more positive. So that's like the very, very simple explanation of that paper, and we'll cover it in the course. And the other one is actually what I believe you're referring to, David, is the paper that found that psychedelics don't affect the serotonin 2A receptor at the same place that serotonin does. It actually goes inside of the cell and affects receptors inside the cell, intracellular receptors. And
that was it.
Yeah. And this suggests that the ability for psychedelics to activate this receptor in a way that boosts neuroplasticity potently is fundamentally different than serotonin, because serotonin doesn't do it the same way psychedelics do. And so this is because psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, I think in the paper they use psilocybin though, are more lipid soluble, so they're able to move through the fat layers of the membrane of the receptor of the cell and go in and affect receptors in there. And so then the question is, can we create molecules that like serotonin, or like helps, or can we even breed mice or something that have serotonin molecules that are more lipid soluble that go in there to induce neuroplasticity? So it kind of opens a door on different ways of thinking about how can we create compounds that share this property of going inside of the cell to boost neuroplasticity and have these effects which have antidepressant potential, basically. And so, it's just refining our understanding of how psychedelics are unique and how they affect these receptors and how they elicit their unique effects.
Awesome. Thanks, Manesh. Yeah, it makes me think about the blood-brain barrier a little bit as well that I've heard is quite relevant, and particularly like delivery mechanisms of psychedelic compounds. Like there's different ways of doing it and a big IP chase for how to do that. Awesome. Thanks, Manesh. Yeah, Melanie, any thoughts that are bubbling away?
Just riffing on the intracellular paper, another consequence of this is that the certain of the serotonergic psychedelics are amongst themselves more fat soluble. So DMT and 5-MeO DMT are particularly fat soluble, so they are able to cross the membrane even more easily. And so they were found in that paper to be especially efficient at promoting neuroplasticity. So it will be interesting if that then lends itself to them having any greater effects in terms of promoting antidepressant outcomes or other kinds of outcomes.
Fascinating. Oh, we could go on. Thank you. This has been a delight, absolute delight. I might enroll in this course. Beautiful. So yeah, I can't wait to see the videos that you've made and to join in the lectures, hopefully. Thank you for making this course happen. I think we really need it. Thanks for all the work that you do. It's so cool to be on the frontier of this work and to be kind of somewhat quirky neuroscientist, not too hardcore.
Yeah.
All right.
Of course. Thank you so much for having us here.
I've been looking forward to it. Yeah. Really lovely to chat. So just tell people to find out more about you, where could they go to find that stuff?
Mm-hmm. For me, you could find me at my YouTube channel, The Psychedelic Scientist, also on Instagram. I've been a bit of a hiatus, but I'm looking to ramp that up, particularly on Instagram in April. So find me on there, The Psychedelic Scientist. Also on Twitter, Girn Neuro. You could find me there. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well, just Manesh Girn. And happy to answer questions, and feel free to reach out.
Awesome.
Cool. And for me, I don't do much social, but I am on LinkedIn, and you can find me by looking for my full name with my middle name included, Melanie Blair Pincus. There's another Melanie Pincus out there who's also a scientist. So yeah, to differentiate myself from her, I include my middle name. And then for the research and design agency that I've launched, Creating Transformative Experiences, I will be launching the website for that really soon. So that's syncopedesignlab.com.
How do we spell that? Syncope?
Syncope is SYNCOPY.
Wow. What's the thinking behind that?
Like, is that like syncopation from the world of music? So it's the way that different rhythms come together and then go off beat again.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I had a thought, folks, listening. Manesh did a fantastic podcast with Rad Siraj on his Minority Trip Report. So if you like the sound of Manesh, he gets a little bit more personal there, and it's a beautiful episode, Manesh. Really is just who you are and your kind of life growing up. So beautiful to check that out. And
thank you. Thanks, David.
Yeah. All right. So thank you again, Manesh Girn, Melanie Pincus. It has been fun. Did you have a good time?
Yes, this was wonderful. My pleasure, truly. Thank you, David.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for listening. And yeah, if you want to find out more about the course, Psychedelic Neuroscience Demystified, go to psychedelicEducationCenter.com. Take care, everyone.